The dressing room door was heavy, solid wood with brass fixtures that caught the dim hallway light. Frank Sinatra sat inside on a leather couch, bow tie loosened, tuxedo jacket draped over the chair back, a glass of Jack Daniels sweating on the table beside him. The Sands Hotel. Las Vegas. December 8th, 1963. 16 days after Dallas. The show had gone well. Standing ovation. 3 encores. The audience hungry for something beautiful, something normal, something that felt like the world still made sense. Frank had given them that. Songs about love and loss and longing. Nothing political. Nothing heavy. Just music. Just escape. He'd closed with "I've Got You Under My Skin" and walked off stage to thunderous applause that felt less like appreciation and more like desperation. People needed to believe in something, needed to feel like there was still magic left. Frank understood that, had carried that weight his entire career. Tonight, it felt heavier. His manager, Hank Sinatra, sat across from him, counting receipts, making notes. The casino sounds filtered through the walls. Slot machines, laughter, the distant hum of people trying to forget. Frank lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. A knock at the door, sharp, insistent. Hank looked up. "We're not seeing anyone." The knock came again. Same rhythm, same force. Frank set his glass down. "Who is it?" A voice from the other side, male, flat. No accent Frank could place. "I need to speak with Mr. Sinatra. It's important." Hank stood, already moving toward the door to turn the person away. Frank held up a hand. Something in the voice. Not threatening exactly, but not casual either. Urgent, certain. Like the man on the other side knew he'd be let in. "Open it," Frank said quietly. Hank's jaw tightened. "Frank. Open it." Hank unlocked the door and pulled it open 6 inches. A man stood in the hallway. Average height. Thin. Dark hair receding slightly. Pale complexion. Eyes that didn't blink as often as they should. He wore a cheap gray suit that didn't fit right, the kind you bought off a rack in a department store. His hands hung at his sides. Empty. Non-threatening. But something about his stillness made the air feel colder. "I need 5 minutes," the man said. His voice was calm. Too calm. Like someone who'd practiced the words until they lost all emotion. Hank blocked the doorway with his body. "Mr. Sinatra isn't taking visitors. If you want an autograph, you can send a request through." "I was in Dallas." The man's eyes stayed on Frank. "Through Hank. Through the door. November 22nd. I need to talk to him about it." The room went silent. Frank's cigarette burned untouched between his fingers. Hank's hand went to the door, ready to slam it shut. Frank stood slowly. "Let him in." "Frank, this could be." "Let him in, Hank." Hank stepped aside. The man walked into the dressing room like he'd been invited to Sunday dinner. No hurry. No hesitation. He didn't look around. Didn't admire the space or the memorabilia or the trappings of fame. Just walked to the center of the room and stopped, hands still at his sides. Frank studied him. The cheap suit, the hollow eyes, the strange stillness. This wasn't a fan, wasn't a reporter, wasn't anyone who belonged in this room. But he was here, and Frank's instincts, honed over decades of reading crowds and mobsters and presidents, told him this man was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with violence. "You've got 5 minutes," Frank said. His voice was steady, no fear, just curiosity edged with steel. The man nodded once. "My name doesn't matter. What matters is I was on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, November 22nd, 12:30 p.m. Hank moved toward the phone. Frank raised a hand without looking. Hank froze. "Keep talking," Frank said. The man's face didn't change. No pride. No shame. Just fact. I pulled the trigger. 3 shots. Third one hit the target. I watched the motorcade scatter. Watched the Secret Service climb on the car. Watched them speed away. Then I left the building. Caught a bus. Went to a movie theater. Got arrested 2 hours later. Frank's cigarette had burned down to his fingers. He stubbed it out slowly, never breaking eye contact. You're telling me you killed the President of the United States, and then you walked into my dressing room to confess? No. The man's voice remained flat. I walked into your dressing room because you sang at the inauguration. You knew him. You believed in him. And I need you to understand something. The room felt smaller. Hank stood rigid by the phone, hand hovering over the receiver. Frank sat back down, motioning for the man to continue. Not because he believed him, not because it made sense, but because something about this moment felt inevitable. Like a scene that had been written before either of them walked into the room. They're going to say I acted alone, the man continued. They're going to say I was crazy, communist, unstable. They're going to make me the story so nobody looks at anything else. And it'll work. Because people need simple answers. Need someone to blame. Need to believe one broken man with a rifle can change history, so they don't have to think about how easy it actually was. Frank leaned forward. Why are you telling me this? Because you have access, connections. You know, people who know people. And I need you to understand that what's coming is going to be worse than what happened. The investigations, the theories, the lies. It's going to tear this country apart. And the truth isn't going to save anyone because the truth is complicated and ugly and nobody wants it. Frank's hands were steady, but his mind was racing. This man was either telling the truth or he was insane. Or both. Either way, Frank had to decide what to do with him. Call security. Call the police. Call someone who could handle this. But something stopped him. The man's eyes. They weren't wild, weren't desperate. They were resigned. Like someone who'd already accepted his fate and was just trying to finish a task before the curtain came down. What do you want from me? Frank asked. Nothing. The man's mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Almost. I just needed one person to hear it before they bury me. Needed someone who mattered to know that whatever they tell you, whatever story they build, it wasn't about ideology or politics or madness. It was simpler than that, and more complicated than anyone will ever admit. Hank moved toward the door. I'm calling security. The man didn't react. Just kept looking at Frank. You were supposed to perform at his second inauguration. January 1965. You had already started planning the set list. The house I live in. My way. Songs about America. About belief. That's not going to happen now. And I'm the reason why. I need you to carry that, to remember that every time someone asks you to sing about hope or patriotism or the future, remember that I took it away, not because I wanted to, because I was supposed to. Frank stood. His body moved before his mind caught up. He crossed the room until he was standing directly in front of the man. Close enough to smell the cheap aftershave. Close enough to see the purple circles under his eyes. Close enough to understand that this person, whatever else he was deeply, irretrievably broken. Who sent you here? Frank's voice was quiet. Dangerous. Nobody sent me. I came because I needed to. Because in 2 days or 2 weeks or 2 months, I'll be dead. And this conversation will be the last honest thing I ever do. The door burst open, hotel security. 3 men in dark suits, moving fast. Hank had made the call. They surrounded the stranger. hands on his arms, pulling him backward. He didn't resist, didn't fight, just let them take him. Eyes still locked on Frank. "Check him," one of the security guards barked. They patted him down. No weapon, no ID, no wallet, just a bus ticket stub in his pocket. Dallas to Las Vegas, one way. Dated 2 days ago. "Who are you?" The lead guard demanded, shaking the man slightly. The stranger said nothing. His eyes stayed on Frank. "Call the police," the guard said to his partner, "and get someone from the FBI. This guy's talking about Dallas." They dragged him toward the door. Frank stood frozen, watching. The man didn't struggle, didn't speak. As they pulled him into the hallway, he turned his head one last time. "They'll say my name over and over," he said quietly. "But they'll never understand who I was. Just remember that when they do." The door slammed shut. The sound of scuffling faded down the hallway. Hank locked the door and turned to Frank. Face pale, hands shaking. "Jesus Christ, Frank. Was that?" "I don't know." Frank walked back to the couch and picked up his glass. Empty. He poured more Jack Daniels. Hand steady, mind churning. "I don't know what that was." Within an hour, the room was full of people. FBI agents, Las Vegas police, hotel management. Everyone asking questions. What did he say? What did he look like? Did he threaten you? Did he confess to anything? Frank answered mechanically. Described the man. Repeated the words as accurately as he could remember them. Watched as they wrote everything down. Exchanged glances. Made phone calls. The man had been taken to a holding cell. No identification. Refused to give his name. Kept asking to speak to Frank Sinatra again. The FBI was running fingerprints, checking records, trying to figure out if this was a credible threat or just another conspiracy nut drawn to the spotlight of tragedy. "Did he seem dangerous?" one of the agents asked. "Young, clean-cut, earnest." Frank considered the question. "No." He seemed finished. The agent frowned. "Finished how?" "Like he was already dead, just waiting for someone to make it official." They kept Frank at the hotel for 3 more hours. Questions, statements, assurances that this would be handled, investigated, resolved. Frank nodded, signed papers, cooperated fully. But something gnawed at him. Something about the man's eyes. The resignation. The certainty. When they finally left, Frank sat alone in the dressing room. Hank had gone to deal with the casino. The hallway was quiet again. Normal. Like nothing had happened. Frank poured another drink and stared at the wall. He thought about November 22nd, where he'd been when he heard. The disbelief. The grief. The sense that something fundamental had broken and would never be fixed. He'd known Kennedy. Not well. Not intimately. But enough. Had sung at the inauguration. Had shaken his hand. Had believed, briefly, that maybe this young president could actually change things. And now, a stranger had walked into his dressing room claiming responsibility. Claiming it was all simpler and more complicated than anyone would understand. Claiming he'd be dead soon. And this was his last honest act. Frank didn't know if the man was telling the truth. Didn't know if it mattered. What he knew was that the country was eating itself alive trying to make sense of Dallas. And this man, whoever he was, had looked Frank in the eye and told him the sense-making was the problem. That the need for simple answers would bury the complicated truth. That the story they'd tell would be more powerful than whatever actually happened. 3 days later, Frank got a call. Middle of the night. Hank on the other end, voice tight. They found him. Frank sat up in bed. Found who? The guy from the dressing room. Hanged himself in his cell, left a note. Just one line. "I already told Sinatra. He knows. Frank closed his eyes. The room spun slightly. Did they identify him? No. Fingerprints didn't match anyone in the system. No dental records. No missing person reports. It's like he didn't exist before he showed up at the hotel. What about the note? FBI took it. Said it's part of an ongoing investigation. Classified. Frank hung up the phone and sat in the darkness. He thought about the man's face. The hollow eyes. The cheap suit. The absolute certainty that he'd be dead soon. The need to confess to someone who'd believed in what was lost. Over the following weeks, Frank received visits. Quiet ones. Men in dark suits who asked him to repeat the story. Who took notes. Who reminded him that national security was at stake. Who suggested, politely but firmly, that discussing the incident publicly would be unwise. Unhelpful. Potentially dangerous. Frank understood what they weren't saying. The man in the dressing room was a problem. An anomaly. A thread that didn't fit the narrative. And Frank, by extension, was a loose end. Not a threat, but a witness to something that complicated the official story. He never spoke about it publicly. Never mentioned the visit in interviews. Never wrote about it in his memoir. The incident was filed away. Classified. Buried under layers of bureaucracy and national interest and the overwhelming need to move forward. But Frank remembered, in quiet moments, late nights after shows, when someone asked him to sing patriotic songs or perform at political events. He'd remember the man's eyes, the resignation, the claim that the truth was too complicated for anyone to accept, the certainty that he'd be erased. Years later, when the conspiracy theories multiplied and the investigations reopened, and the country remained fractured over what had happened in Dallas, Frank would think about that night. About the stranger who walked into his dressing room carrying a confession nobody wanted. About the note that got classified. About the body with no name. He never knew if the man was telling the truth, never found out who he really was, or why he chose Frank to receive his final testament. But he carried it, the weight of that conversation. The knowledge that some truths get buried not because they're false, but because they're too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The official file on the incident remained classified, sealed, restricted. The man's identity was never confirmed. The note was never released. The conversation in the dressing room became a footnote in a file that almost nobody would ever read. Frank performed for decades after that night. Sang about love and loss and America and hope. Stood on stages and delivered the magic people needed. Carried the weight of being a symbol when he was just a man who'd witnessed something he couldn't explain and wasn't allowed to share. He died in 1998. The file was still classified. The man's name was still unknown. The truth, if there was one, remained locked away in bureaucratic vaults where complicated stories go to die. But on December 8th, 1963, in a dressing room at the Sands Hotel, two men had a conversation that would never be officially acknowledged. One of them confessed. The other listened. And whatever happened in that room, whatever truth or delusion passed between them, it remained sealed.